Hello everyone, clinicians. This is Nasseh, and I'm coming to you here from Seattle, Washington. Alright, I want to show you guys a quick radiograph. This patient has pain. Take a look at this radiograph and tell me, what do you think is the diagnosis? Alright, let's come back and talk about it. Alright folks, it's a kind of an overcast and a little bit of a chilly day here in Seattle. I figured I'll do a little video tutorial. So let's get back to the question I asked about the x-ray. What's the problem? Well, that's actually a really trick question, because when it comes to diagnosis, a radiograph alone is not diagnostic. It's really nothing more than one piece of the puzzle. At the school, if I'm stopped by one of the students, shows me a radiograph and says, well, what do I think about it? And I see a pathology or something on the x-ray, I usually answer in some ways of saying, well, it's a nice looking x-ray or something like that. But the fact here is that the art of diagnosis is really about listening to the patient, doing a good and thorough patient interview, gathering all of the historical facts, and then making sense out of all that information in context of a thorough intraoral and extraoral examination. You never make a diagnosis for any treatment that you see clinically based on the x-ray alone, as the radiograph is not only just one piece of the puzzle on its own, it can actually be misleading. So case in point, for example, in the case that I just showed you, if you were to look at the radiograph, the first thing that you see is a large lesion around the apex of the first molar. So it's possible to quickly say, well, there is an infection associated with the first molar and we need to get in there and either do an apical or retreat the tooth. However, when we listen to the patient's chief complaint, we begin to understand that the patient complains of lingering pain to cold and spontaneous pain are the main factor. Now, these are signs of reversible pulpitis and not acute apical periodontitis. So when we do our clinical cold and sensibility testing, then we then find out that the offending tooth is actually the second molar rather than the first molar. Now, one of the reasons that I wanted to discuss this case with you is because this is actually the very first clinical case done using hydraulic condensation and bioceramics here in North America. How do I know that? Well, I know it because I did the case myself, and it's the day after the FDA approval of bioceramics in the US. And of course, I had done the testing on the extracted teeth for months leading up to it and worked with the scientists and the manufacturer before to validate this technique. But the main goal here was to harness the power of bioceramics in a responsible way, which is to use the material as a sealer along with gutta percha and not as a pure cement fill to fill the canal, the whole canal, which would make it difficult to retreat then. So this is the actual historical case where the whole thing began. Anyway, now over 20 extracted teeth that I had done to hone the technique, went on to isolate the tooth and creating primary isolation, and then doing a secondary isolation, the fluid tight isolation with some caulking agent, and then removed the composite and found some decay underneath there, which was the source of the pulpitis and something that couldn't be seen originally in the radiograph. Now, after using the caries indicating solution to remove all the decay, access was then made into the pulp chamber. Two mesial canals and a wide oval distal canal were isolated and instrumented using the conventional endosequence technique, which was available at that time. These canals were fairly large and were instrumented to a size 40-04 and 50-04 and then dried using paper points. Looking at the high magnification showed clean canals ready for obturation. BC sealer was then injected in the coronal 2/3 of the roots. A radiograph was then taken to confirm this. Now keep in mind that this was really the first case that I had done, so I took this sealer radiograph to confirm sealer injection to the depth that I wanted, but this radiograph is really not necessary. I then seated each master cone to full length and confirmed full seating. In the oval distal canal, there was additional space on the sides of the master cone. So what I did is I placed additional cones to fill the space in order to prevent too much pooling of the sealer and to provide a denser looking fill. Once the cones were seated, they were seared off at the orifice level and were compacted with a size 10 and 9 plugger at the orifice. I then placed a thin layer of glass ionomer over the canals to immediately seal the chamber and reduce coronal leakage before placing cotton and cavit. The patient left and had the tooth restored. He was told to return to treat the first molar, but unfortunately he didn't. So this was in early 2008. Finally, he returned in 2015 since he was having pain on the first molar, and this helped me take a 7-year recall x-ray showing the tooth restored and stable. The radiolucency in the first molar was still obviously there since it wasn't retreated, but unfortunately when we attempted to retreat this tooth, a long vertical root fracture was found in the mesiolingual aspect of this first molar, and the tooth was deemed a poor risk for a restoration, was then referred for extraction. But this whole experience allowed me to see this very first patient 7 years following the initial root canal obtained this radiograph. I finally got a hold of this patient actually recently, but he had moved from Boston to a different state, but he then confirmed over the phone that he still had the tooth and the tooth was asymptomatic and crowned and doing well. So this is really the oldest case of hydraulic condensation here in North America, and a testament that the technique, the way we worked it out here at Real Dendo, works and is predictable. Of course, the technique worked primarily in this case because of the proper diagnosis and good instrumentation, as well as good irrigation, getting the canals to a respectable size. But it's also good to know that the obturation, which was much more efficient than the other techniques available at that time, vertical condensation, if you will, is also predictable over this long period of time. Today, hydraulic condensation, or synchronized hydraulic condensation as we call it, as it was developed by Real Dendo, is an established obturation technique which is growing in popularity around the world. It's really the fastest growing obturation technique. And this case still around and serving this patient well is the first one that started this whole revolution. I wanted to share it with you. So kind of freezing here, it's a little overcast in the cold and brisk Seattle air, so I'm going to go back inside. But from Seattle, Washington, I'm Ali Nasseh, and let's save some teeth.